January 8, 2005, the Pacific Ocean, 525 feet below the surface. A black leviathan of steel 110 meters long, displacing 6,900 tons, is tearing through the water at a terrifying speed, 35 knots. To a civilian driving a car, 35 knots might not seem fast, but for a nuclear submarine submerged in the dense medium of the ocean, this is flank speed. The kinetic energy generated by this mass moving at this velocity is equivalent to a freight train going off the rails. Inside the hull, however, the atmosphere is relaxed. It is lunchtime. The smell of food drifts from the galley. In the crew's mess, sailors are laughing, eating, and talking about their upcoming port call in Brisbane, Australia. It is supposed to be a Liberty run, a goodwill visit. In the control room, the nerve center of the ship, Commander Kevin Mooney is reviewing the charts. Everything appears perfect. The navigation systems indicate that the ocean ahead is deep, empty, and safe. But they are wrong. The charts are wrong. And in exactly 3 seconds, the world of the 137 men on board is going to be turned upside down. There is no warning. There is no frantic sonar contact. There is no time to brace. The collision is instantaneous and violent. A massive impact shakes the entire vessel with the force of a train wreck. The 7,000-ton vessel comes to a dead stop in less than 2 seconds. Physics takes over. Inside the submarine, momentum turns everything not bolted down into a projectile. Sailors are thrown 20 feet through the air like rag dolls. Men are smashed against steel bulkheads, control panels, and machinery. In the mess hall, trays of food forks and knives become shrapnel. In the con, Commander Mooney is thrown from his chair, slamming his head against the periscope stand. The lights die. Darkness swallows the ship. The only sounds are the screaming of twisting metal, the shattering of glass, and the cries of injured men. The submarine rolls violently to one side. They haven't hit another ship. They haven't been hit by a torpedo. They have just slammed head-on into a massive uncharted underwater mountain. According to every law of physics and naval history, at a depth of 500 feet, at that speed, the pressure hull should have shattered. The ocean pressure should have crushed the sub in a fraction of a second, killing everyone instantly, just like the tragedies of the USS Thresher or the Russian Kursk. But the miracle, or rather the pinnacle of American naval engineering happened. The hull did not break. The ship is still alive. This is the story of the USS San Francisco SSN 711, and why the Los Angeles class is known as the indestructible monster of the deep. To understand how the San Francisco survived a crash that should have been fatal, we have to look at its design DNA. This isn't just a boat. It is a 688. During the Cold War, while the Soviet Union focused on size and brute force building the massive Typhoon class, the United States Navy focused on stealth and resilience. The Los Angeles class was born in the 1970s, with one mission to be the deadliest hunter in the ocean. It had to be fast enough to chase down carriers, quiet enough to vanish, and tough enough to take a beating. The secret lies in its skeleton. The USS San Francisco is built from HY-80 steel. This is not construction-grade metal. It is a high-yield alloy tempered with a classified formula to achieve incredible elasticity and strength. It is rated to withstand 80,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. But the metal is only half the story. The weld is the other half. American submarines are built under the SubSafe program, a quality assurance protocol written in the blood of the 129 sailors who died on the USS Thresher in 1963. Since that disaster, every single inch of every weld on a U.S. submarine is X-rayed, ultrasonically tested, and signed off by a certified engineer. If a weld has a microscopic crack, the entire plate is rejected. It was this American obsession with perfection, this paranoia for quality, that saved the crew of the San Francisco. When the sub hit the mountain, the HY-80 steel didn't crack like glass. It absorbed the kinetic energy. It deformed. It crumpled. But it refused to let the ocean in. Let's go back to that fateful journey. The USS San Francisco had left Guam for Australia. To get there quickly, they were running deep and fast. But navigating underwater is like driving a race car down a dark tunnel with no headlights. Submarines have no windows. The crew relies on two things, sonar and charts. Active sonar is rarely used because the sound gives away the submarine's position. They rely on passive sonar, which simply listens. But a mountain of rock makes no noise. To the passive sonar, the seamount was invisible. And the chart. The chart was the fatal flaw. The ocean floor is less mapped than the surface of Mars. The chart Commander Mooney was using showed clear water. But nature had placed a dormant volcano right in his path. At 11:42 a.m., the depth sounding read 2,000 fathoms. Safe. Deep. Seconds later, the bottom rushed up to meet them like a wall. The impact was pure violence. Machinist's mate second class, Joseph Ashley, a 24-year-old sailor, was thrown against a pump in the machinery room. The impact caused severe head injuries. Across the ship, 98 sailors suffered broken bones, lacerations, and concussions. Blood began to slick the tilting decks. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the pain. It was the sound. After the crash came the hiss of high-pressure airlines rupturing, the groan of the hull, and then the sound every submariner fears most, the sound of rushing water. If the pressure hull is breached, water at 16 atmospheres will cut through steel like a laser. It will flood the boat in seconds, dragging it down to crush depth. Emergency blow, emergency blow. Commander Mooney, bleeding from the head, struggling to stand on the listing deck, gave the order. It was their only hope. They had to dump high-pressure air into the ballast tanks to force the water out and make the ship light enough to surface. The diving officer slammed the activation switches. Compressed air screamed into the ballast tanks with the force of a jet engine. The sound was deafening, but the ship hesitated. It didn't shoot up like a cork. The bow, the entire nose of the submarine containing the massive sonar sphere, had been crushed. The sonar dome was gone. The steel was mangled. The wreckage at the front was acting like a massive anchor dragging the ship down. The San Francisco shuddered. The stern sank. The bow dipped. For a few agonizing seconds, the 137 men in the dark wondered if this was the end. They wondered if they were about to join the men of the Thresher and the Scorpion on eternal patrol. But the hull held. The HY-80 steel did its job. The reactor compartment containing the S-6G nuclear core remained perfectly intact. Not a single microsievert of radiation leaked. The structural integrity of the crew compartment held firm against the crushing weight of the Pacific. Slowly, painfully, slowly, the ship began to rise. The buoyancy won the battle against gravity. The USS San Francisco, battered, broken, and blind, clawed its way to the surface. When they broke the surface, sunlight flooded through the periscope, but the battle was far from over. They were hundreds of miles from help. The navigation was dead. The sonar was destroyed. The crew was decimated by injuries, and they didn't know if the hull would hold together in the surface waves, but they were breathing. Unlike Soviet designs, which often prioritized speed or depth over structural resilience or used double hulls that were difficult to inspect, the American single-hull design had proven a critical point. The quality of the steel matters more than the thickness of the wall. The crash of the USS San Francisco wasn't just an accident. It was the ultimate unplanned crash test of U.S. naval technology. And the result of that test was sitting on the surface of the Pacific, refusing to sink. When the ship was finally towed into dry dock, the photos of the damage would shock the world. The entire front of the submarine was missing. It looked like it had been chewed off by a giant beast. Seeing that damage, naval engineers were left with only one conclusion: it is a miracle that anyone is alive. The USS San Francisco was on the surface, but the nightmare was far from over. The submarine was bobbing helplessly in the Pacific swells, hundreds of miles from the nearest land. Inside the steel tube, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The emergency lighting cast eerie shadows over the tilting decks. The air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, ozone from fried electronics, and the metallic scent of blood. The collision had generated G-forces so violent that 98 crew members, nearly three-quarters of the entire complement, were injured. Men were lying in the passageways with broken arms, shattered ribs, and severe concussions. The ship's corpsman, the only medically trained specialist on board, was overwhelmed. The crew's mess, usually a place for meals and movies, was instantly converted into a field hospital. Sailors with basic first aid training ripped up sheets to make bandages and used duct tape to splint broken bones. They were working in semi-darkness, fighting the nausea of the rolling ship, trying to keep their shipmates alive. Among the casualties, machinist's mate, second-class Joseph Ashley, was in critical condition. He had been thrown 20 feet against a steel pump assembly. His shipmates rallied around him, taking turns manually pumping a resuscitation bag to help him breathe. For the next 30 hours, the entire focus of the crew would be divided into two desperate missions: keeping the ship afloat and keeping Petty Officer Ashley alive. In the control room, Commander Kevin Mooney faced a tactical situation that was almost impossible. The ship was blind. The sonar sphere in the bow, the submarine's primary eye, was completely destroyed. The navigation charts were proven to be fatally inaccurate. The radio antennas were damaged. They were adrift in an area of the ocean known for hidden seamounts, and they had no way of seeing what was below them. Worse, they didn't know the extent of the damage to the hull. They knew the bow was crushed, but they didn't know if the structural integrity of the forward ballast tanks had been compromised. If those tanks lost their air bubble, the heavy nose of the submarine would drag them back under. The crew had to perform a delicate balancing act, shifting fuel and water to the rear of the ship to keep the nose up. Every wave that crashed over the bow sent a shudder of fear through the boat. Would the steel hold, or would the next wave be the one that broke the ship's back? Slowly, the engineers managed to restore partial power. The backup diesel generator roared to life, sucking in fresh air from the surface. They managed to rig an emergency radio antenna and broadcast a distress signal. The message was received by the U.S. Pacific Command in Hawaii. The response was immediate. Ships and helicopters were scrambled from Guam, but the ocean is vast. It would take time for help to arrive. For the sailors of the San Francisco, time was the enemy. The journey back to Guam was a slow, agonizing crawl. The submarine could only manage a few knots. The hull groaned and creaked with every swell, a constant reminder of the violence they had endured. But as the hours turned into a day, the Los Angeles-class sub proved its worth. The propulsion plant, the nuclear reactor, continued to operate flawlessly. Despite the impact, the shock-hardened mounts of the reactor vessel had done their job. The steam turbines spun. The propeller turned. The indestructible reputation of the 688 class was being proven in real time. However, despite the heroic efforts of the medical team and the arrival of a helicopter to evacuate the wounded, tragedy struck. Petty Officer Joseph Ashley succumbed to his injuries. He was the only fatality of the incident. His death was a somber blow to a crew that had performed a miracle. But his sacrifice underscored the brutal reality of submarine service. The margin between life and death is often measured in inches of steel and seconds of reaction time. When the USS San Francisco finally limped into Opera Harbor, Guam on January 10th, it was a ghost ship. It was listing to one side. Its outer coating was stripped away, but it was under its own power. As the tugboats guided it toward the dry dock, the true scale of the disaster was hidden beneath the water. The sailors standing on the deck knew they had hit something hard, but no one, not even the captain, was prepared for what they would see when the water was drained from the dock. This story of survival is a testament to the training of the U.S. Navy, but it is also a story about the machines they trust with their lives. At Cold War Confidential, we dig deep into the engineering marvels and the human stories behind the hardware. If you want to see more true stories of survival against impossible odds, please hit that subscribe button. We bring you the history that others forget. The draining of the dry dock was a slow reveal. As the water level dropped, the black hull of the submarine began to emerge. First the sail, then the upper casing, and then the bow. A collective gasp went through the shipyard workers and naval engineers gathered on the pier. The front of the submarine was gone. The entire sonar dome, a structure the size of a small house, had been obliterated. The thick steel of the forward compartment looked like a crushed soda can. The torpedo tubes were twisted. The heavy steel shutters were ripped off. It looked as if a giant beast had taken a bite out of the front of the ship. The photos taken that day are some of the most shocking images in naval history. They show the raw, violent power of kinetic energy. But looking closer at those photos reveals the genius of American design. The destruction stopped exactly at the pressure hull boundary. The sonar dome on a Los Angeles-class submarine is essentially a free flood area. It is filled with water and houses the sensitive hydrophones. Behind it sits the forward pressure bulkhead, a massive curved wall of HY-80 steel that protects the crew. The nose of the ship had acted like the crumple zone of a modern car. It absorbed the massive energy of the impact, crushing and folding, sacrificing itself to dissipate the force before it reached the nuclear reactor or the crew compartments. This is the critical difference between the tragedy of the Russian submarine Kursk and the miracle of the San Francisco. The Kursk was destroyed by an internal explosion that ruptured the pressure hull. The San Francisco survived an external collision because its pressure hull was over-engineered. The HY-80 steel didn't shatter. It bent. The sub-safe welds held. It was a vindication of billions of dollars in research and rigorous safety protocols. The investigation that followed cleared the crew of negligence, but highlighted the dangers of relying on charts. The underwater mountain simply wasn't on the map. It was a phantom obstacle. Commander Mooney was relieved of command, a standard procedure when a ship runs aground, but his quick thinking and the order to emergency blow were credited with saving the ship. But the story of SSN 711 didn't end in the scrapyard. The Navy determined that the reactor and the rest of the ship were still in perfect condition. It was too valuable to throw away. In a feat of engineering Frankensteinism, the Navy decided to repair it. But they didn't build a new nose. Instead, they took the bow off the USS Honolulu, another Los Angeles-class sub that was being retired due to reactor costs. In a massive dry dock operation, engineers cut the front off the Honolulu and welded it onto the San Francisco. It was a perfect transplant. The Franken sub returned to service, sailing for another decade before finally retiring. This operation proved that the Los Angeles class was modular, tough, and adaptable. Today, the sail of the USS San Francisco stands as a memorial in Guam. It honors Joseph Ashley and the spirit of the crew. But for military historians and engineers, the legacy of SSN 711 is simple. It is the ship that fought a mountain and won. It proved that in the unforgiving arena of the deep ocean, American steel and American training are the best insurance policy a sailor can have. The Soviet Union may have built them bigger. They may have built them faster. But when it came to the ultimate test of survival, the United States built them stronger. The survival of the USS San Francisco was a miracle, but the aftermath presented the U.S. Navy with a difficult question. What do you do with a nuclear submarine that has no nose, the sonar dome? The forward ballast tanks and the torpedo room shutters were mangled beyond repair. In any other navy, a ship with this level of structural damage would be scrapped. The Soviet Union, for example, had a history of dragging their damaged nuclear submarines to hidden bays in the Arctic and leaving them to rust and leak radiation, creating floating graveyards like Gromyka Bay. But the United States Navy operates differently. The engineers looked at the San Francisco and saw that the most expensive and complex part of the ship, the nuclear reactor and the propulsion drive, was pristine. The heart of the ship was strong, only the face was broken. They decided to do something unprecedented in modern naval history: a head transplant. It just so happened that another Los Angeles-class submarine, the USS Honolulu SSN 718, was scheduled for retirement. The Honolulu was in perfect structural shape, but its reactor was running out of fuel. Refueling a reactor costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Fixing a steel nose costs less. So the Navy devised a plan that sounded like science fiction. They would cut the front off the Honolulu and weld it onto the San Francisco. This was not as simple as swapping parts on a car. We are talking about HY-80 steel, the toughest metal in the maritime world. You cannot just cut it with a torch. The transplant operation required laser precision measurements. The hull sections had to be aligned within millimeters. The welding process required preheating the steel to specific temperatures to ensure the molecular bond was perfect. One microscopic bubble in the weld could lead to a catastrophic hull breach at deep dive depths. The operation took nearly 2 years and cost $134 million. But it worked. The Frankensub was reborn. The USS San Francisco returned to the fleet a hybrid warrior, carrying the spirit of 2 ships. This engineering feat sent a powerful message to the world: American submarines are so valuable and so well built that even smashing them into a mountain isn't enough to kill them. But the crash also forced the Navy to confront a terrifying blind spot: the Phantom Mountain. How could the most technologically advanced Navy on Earth, equipped with satellites and gravity mapping sensors, miss a 6,000-foot mountain rising from the abyss? The investigation revealed a chilling reality about our knowledge of the ocean. We have mapped the surface of Mars with better resolution than the floor of the Pacific. The chart Commander Mooney used was based on data from a 1989 Landsat satellite. The satellite measured gravity anomalies to guess the depth of the water. But the physics of the mountain tricked the satellite. The mass of the rock didn't distort the gravity field enough to register as a hazard. To the satellite, the water looked deep. To the submarine, it was a solid wall. Since the crash, the Navy has overhauled its navigation procedures. They no longer rely solely on passive maps. In areas of discolored water or uncertain terrain, submarines are now required to use active high-frequency sonar, a mine avoidance mode, to paint a picture of the darkness ahead. The crash of SSN 711 rewrote the book on underwater navigation, ensuring that no other crew would have to face the same terror. Comparing this incident to the disasters of the Russian Navy reveals a stark difference in philosophy. In 2003, while the San Francisco was being repaired, the Russian Navy was trying to tow a decommissioned nuclear submarine, the K-159, to the scrapyard. The K-159 was a rusted hulk, its pontoons leaking. During a storm, the pontoons failed. The sub sank like a stone, taking 9 sailors to their deaths, and leaving 800 kilograms of spent uranium fuel on the bottom of the Barents Sea. The contrast is undeniable. The Russians lost a submarine due to negligence and poor maintenance in a simple towing operation. The Americans saved a submarine that had suffered a high-speed collision with a mountain. One force is plagued by a culture of good enough. The other is defined by the culture of subsafe. Today, the USS San Francisco has finally retired from combat duty, but it still serves. It has been converted into a moored training ship, MTS 711, in Charleston, South Carolina. Its reactor has been removed, but its hull remains. It now serves as a classroom for the next generation of nuclear officers. Young sailors walk the same decks where Joseph Ashley died. They touch the same steel that held back the Pacific Ocean. They learn firsthand that the machines they operate are built to bring them home no matter what. The story of the USS San Francisco is more than just a crash report. It is a legend of resilience. It proves that in the unforgiving realm of the deep, there is no substitute for quality. You can't cheat physics with propaganda. When the metal meets the mountain, only the best engineering survives. The Soviet Union tried to conquer the ocean with numbers. The United States conquered it with excellence. And the scarred, welded, unbreakable hull of the USS San Francisco stands as the ultimate proof. This concludes our deep dive into the miracle sub. The Cold War may be over, but the lessons learned in the dark depths are still saving lives today. If you want to see more stories of American engineering triumphing over disaster, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Cold War Confidential. We don't just tell you what happened, we show you why it matters. Dismissed.